Maplewood Drive was the kind of street you'd expect to see on a postcard. Neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and children playing under the warm afternoon sun. The hum of sprinklers, the distant bark of a dog, and the faint sound of a lawnmower filled the air. It was peaceful, it was familiar, it was home. Tom Reynolds had lived there for almost 5 years. A single father raising his 10-year-old son, Jake. Tom was a quiet man with steady eyes and a calm demeanor, the kind of guy neighbors nodded to but rarely stopped to chat with. He kept to himself, not because he didn't like people, but because he had learned early in life to keep his past private. Jake, on the other hand, was the life of the street. His laughter bounced from driveway to driveway as he chased his soccer ball, oblivious to the world's complexities. He was full of energy and dreams, the kind of kid who'd stop to help a younger child or pick up a stray baseball for a neighbor. Today was no different. Jake kicked his soccer ball hard against the garage door of their house, a satisfied grin lighting up his freckled face. "Again, Dad. One more time," he shouted, breathless from running. Tom smiled, watching from the porch as Jake chased the ball. Those moments were precious, moments that felt like they could last forever in their quiet bubble. But lately, that bubble had been shrinking. Rumors began swirling about a new presence on Maplewood Drive, a group calling themselves HOA enforcers. They weren't the usual neighborhood committee members who sent out polite reminders about lawn care or trash cans left out too long. No, these people acted differently, louder, harsher, and more aggressive. At first Tom thought it was nothing, just some overzealous homeowners trying to flex authority. But then he noticed the change. The way neighbors spoke in hushed tones about confrontations on front porches. The way windows were shut quickly when someone approached. Even the dogs seemed restless, barking at strangers who didn't belong. Tom's instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of challenges, told him something was wrong. He didn't like it, not one bit. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the street, Jake was playing with his ball near the corner where the new enforcers had started to make their rounds. Tom called him back, but Jake's attention was caught by a group of men he'd never seen before. They weren't in uniform, but they carried themselves like they were on official business. Clipboards in hand, stern faces, and a no-nonsense attitude that didn't belong in a place like this. Jake, curious and fearless as always, wandered closer. One of the men, tall with a square jaw and a tight-lipped smirk, caught sight of him. Mark was his name, and he'd decided early on that kids like Jake were part of the problem to be managed. "Hey kid, this is private property," Mark said sharply, stepping forward. Jake blinked, unsure. "I live here." Mark's smirk widened, but it wasn't friendly. "Not if you're out of line." Jake kicked the ball again, aiming it away from the man. It bounced erratically, striking Mark's shin. "Watch it," Mark snapped, his voice rising. Before Tom could intervene, Mark reached out and shoved Jake just enough to unbalance him. Jake stumbled, falling to the cracked concrete with a sharp scrape across his knee. He didn't cry right away. Kids are tough like that. But when the pain hit, tears welled up, and his small frame shook. Tom's heart clenched as he rushed forward, anger rising like a storm inside. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Not here, not with his son. He knelt beside Jake, brushing dirt from the scrape with a practiced hand. "Are you okay?" Tom asked gently. Jake nodded, sniffing. But the fear in his eyes lingered. Mark stood back, arms crossed. Watching like he had the right to control the street, Tom stood up slowly, locking eyes with Mark. "Leave him alone," Tom said, voice low but steady. Mark laughed, a cold sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Who's going to stop me?" "You." The street seemed to hold its breath. Tom's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm, a calm that hid something deeper, something dangerous. Mark smirked, clearly enjoying the show, then turned and walked away. But Tom knew this was just the beginning. As he helped Jake to his feet, a weight settled over him, the kind that only a parent feels when their child is hurt by someone who thinks they can push around the innocent. This wasn't just a scrape or a shove. This was a warning, and Tom was ready to make sure no one would threaten his family again. The next morning on Maplewood Drive felt different. The usual hum of lawnmowers and sprinklers was replaced by an uneasy silence, like the calm before a storm. Neighbors peered cautiously out their windows, whispering about what had happened the day before. Tom and Jake's scrape and shove were now the talk of the street, but no one wanted to say much openly, not yet. Fear had a way of silencing even the closest communities. Mark and Phil, the self-appointed HOA enforcers, seemed to thrive on that fear. They arrived each day in their beaten-up pickup truck, clipboards and coffee cups in hand, looking like they owned the neighborhood, or at least wanted to believe they did. Mark, tall and imposing with a square jaw that rarely softened, was the leader. Phil was his sidekick, less confident but just as eager to enforce rules nobody had agreed on. Their mission, as they saw it, was simple. Keep Maplewood Drive in line, which, to them, meant controlling everything from where people parked to how children behaved in their own yards. Tom watched from his porch as Mark stormed over to Mrs. Simmons' house, where she was unloading groceries. "Your trash bins were out past the allowed time," Mark barked without warning. Mrs. Simmons blinked, confused. "I just brought these in. Maybe 5 minutes late." "That's not the point," Mark said, tone sharp. "Rules are rules." Phil hovered nearby, jotting notes on his clipboard like a kid eager for approval. Across the street, a teenager on his skateboard stopped abruptly when Mark gave him a stern look. Skateboarding is banned on sidewalks, Mark announced loudly, as if delivering the town's most urgent news. The kid shrugged and rolled away, but the message was clear. Mark and Phil were here to enforce, no matter what. Jake, curious but cautious after yesterday's incident, stayed close to Tom's side. "Why are those guys so mean?" Jake asked softly, as he clutched his scraped knee. Tom looked down at his son, wanting to give a simple answer, but knowing it wouldn't be enough. "They think they have the right to boss everyone around," he said, voice steady, but laced with frustration. Jake frowned. "But they're not the HOA, right?" "No," Tom admitted. "Not really." That's when the first whispers started, rumors that Mark and Phil weren't officially part of the HOA at all. They had no real authority, just a misplaced sense of power and control. Tom's military-trained mind pieced together a worrying picture. People like Mark didn't just appear by accident. There was usually something, or someone, behind them. As the day went on, the tension in the neighborhood thickened. Neighbors started locking their doors earlier, avoiding eye contact on the sidewalks. Even the children played more quietly. The joyful noise replaced by cautious glances and whispered warnings. Tom decided it was time to talk to the HOA board. Maybe they could help, but the board was surprisingly silent. At the next HOA meeting, Tom watched as Mark and Phil sat smugly in the back, their presence unsettling. He stood up and asked pointed questions about their role and authority. The board members shuffled uncomfortably, giving vague answers and avoiding eye contact. It was clear, no one wanted to confront the problem, frustrated but not surprised. Tom left the meeting knowing the neighborhood was on its own. Mark and Phil seemed to take that silence as permission to push harder. Fake violation notices appeared on doors, letters, warning of fines for minor or made-up infractions. Cars were blocked in driveways, forcing residents to park blocks away. And worst of all, Jake began to dread the walk home from school. One afternoon, Jake was cornered near the park by Mark and Phil. "Stay out of trouble, kid," Mark sneered, stepping close enough to block his path. Jake's heart pounded. He looked around, hoping for help, but the street felt empty. Tom had warned him about these men, but now Jake was feeling the full weight of their intimidation. That night, Tom sat beside Jake's bed, running a cool cloth over his scraped knee. "I promise," Tom said quietly, "no one's going to hurt you again." Jake looked up with tired eyes. "But what if they come back?" Tom hesitated because the truth was, he didn't want to show fear, not to Jake. "They won't," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." But deep inside, Tom knew this was only the beginning of a battle that would test everything he had fought for, because on Maplewood Drive, shadows were growing, and they weren't just in the evening light. The days after the park incident stretched long and heavy. Jake was quieter now, less eager to run free in the neighborhood he once called his playground. Tom could see the change in his son's eyes, that flicker of hesitation, the subtle shadow of fear creeping in where there had been only trust. One evening, Tom sat on the porch, the fading orange light painting long shadows over Maplewood Drive. Jake was inside, quietly doing his homework, but Tom's mind was elsewhere. The neighborhood he had once seen as a safe haven now felt like a trap closing in around them. Then came the knock. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he opened the door to find Mark and Phil standing there, clipboard in hand, their faces blank masks of false authority. "We need to talk about your son," Mark said, voice sharp and cold. Tom's jaw tightened. "What about him?" Phil stepped forward. "He's been causing trouble, kicking balls near our patrol, running in the streets, and making a scene." Tom fought the rising anger. "Jake is a kid. He plays like any other kid." Mark's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a playground. We keep this neighborhood safe, and that means rules." Tom stepped out onto the porch, blocking their way. "Who gave you the right to enforce rules? You're not official. You're not the HOA. You're nothing but bullies." Mark smirked. "Watch your tone, Reynolds. You don't want this to get ugly." Tom's voice dropped calm but deadly serious. "I don't want trouble, but if you touch my son again, if you threaten my family, you won't like what happens next." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Mark laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You don't scare me." Tom's eyes darkened, the calm fading to something colder, more dangerous. "Try me." For a moment the two men stared at each other, the street holding its breath. Then, without another word, Mark and Phil turned and left, their footsteps echoing like a challenge. Tom closed the door and leaned against it, his mind racing. He knew these men were playing a dangerous game, one they didn't understand he was trained for. He thought back to his years in the military, the discipline and skills that had kept him alive in the worst situations. He wasn't a man who threatened lightly. Inside, Jake peeked out from the window, watching his father with wide eyes. "Dad," he whispered. Tom smiled softly. "I'm here, Jake. Nothing's going to happen to you." That night, as Jake slept, Tom sat at the kitchen table, staring at a photo of his family. He knew this was more than neighborhood drama. This was a fight for their peace, their safety, their lives. The next day, Tom started documenting everything. Every encounter, every threat, every violation notice that had no basis. He spoke quietly with neighbors, some fearful, some angry, all unsure what to do. Mark and Phil's presence was dividing the community, turning friends into strangers. But Tom was ready to stand at a neighborhood barbecue. A few days later, Tom found himself face to face with Mark again. This time, the tension was electric. "You think you can run this street?" Mark sneered. Tom didn't flinch. "This is my home, my son's home, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." Mark's eyes flickered with doubt, maybe for the first time. The crowd around them was silent, watching the showdown unfold. That night, Tom called an old friend, someone who understood the dangers of standing alone. "I've got a situation," Tom said quietly. "These guys aren't just bullies, they're trouble." His friend's voice was steady, reassuring. "Stay sharp. Keep your family close. Don't give them an inch." Tom hung up, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. He was no stranger to danger, but this was personal, because when your child is hurt, you don't just walk away, you fight. And Tom Reynolds was ready to fight harder than ever before. The next neighborhood meeting was the most crowded one Maplewood Drive had seen in years. Word had spread fast. Tensions were boiling, and people wanted answers. Tom sat near the back, his eyes scanning the room. Mark and Phil were there too, seated confidently, their clipped smiles hiding their impatience. The HOA board members shuffled papers nervously, aware that the neighborhood's peace was fraying fast. When it was Tom's turn to speak, the room quieted instantly. He stood calm and measured and looked around the room at neighbors whose faces reflected worry, fatigue, and frustration. "We need to address what's really happening here," Tom began, his voice steady but serious. "This isn't just about lawn rules or noise complaints. We have people here abusing power they don't have, intimidating children, and dividing a community." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mark and Phil exchanged glances but said nothing. Tom continued, "I've kept my past private because it doesn't define who I am today. But if you want to understand why I'm standing here, why I'm willing to fight for this neighborhood, you should know the truth." A hush fell over the room. Tom took a breath. "I served in special forces. I've faced threats most people can't imagine. I'm trained to handle situations like this, and I'm not afraid to protect my family and my community." The room went silent. Mark's smirk faded, replaced by something unreadable. A few neighbors looked shocked, others impressed, but a skeptical voice broke the silence. "What does that have to do with HOA rules?" asked Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman from down the street. Tom met her gaze. "It means I'm not just a concerned neighbor. I'm someone who won't stand by while bullies try to take control, and I'm here to make sure this community doesn't fall apart." The board chairman cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation back to bylaws and regulations, but the momentum had shifted. Mark and Phil exchanged uneasy looks, clearly caught off guard. As the meeting dragged on, Tom could see the fractures forming. Some neighbors wanted to stand up and support him, others were too scared or indifferent. Outside, the sun set low, casting long shadows over the street that now felt less like a neighborhood and more like a battlefield. In the days that followed, Tom didn't rest. He gathered evidence, photos of Mark and Phil's intimidation tactics, copies of fake violation notices, and statements from neighbors who had suffered in silence. He shared the information discreetly with a few trusted residents, encouraging them to stand together. "We're stronger united," he reminded them. But Mark and Phil weren't done. Their harassment escalated louder, more aggressive. Cars were vandalized, mailboxes smashed. It was no longer just about rules. It was about control and fear. One evening, as Tom was locking up the house, he saw Mark lurking near the Reynolds driveway. Without hesitation, Tom stepped outside. "Mark," he said, voice calm but firm. "This ends now," Mark sneered. "You think you can stop me? You're just one man." Tom's gaze hardened. "I'm one man who's not afraid to protect what matters." Mark's bravado cracked. He turned and walked away. But Tom knew this wasn't over. That night, Tom sat beside Jake's bed, watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in days. He vowed silently, no matter what came next, he would keep his family safe. Because in this neighborhood, invisible battles were being fought every day, and some fathers were prepared to face them head on. Tom Reynolds knew that in every fight, knowing your own strength wasn't enough. You had to understand your enemy, and more importantly, you had to control the battle mentally and physically. As the days passed, Mark and Phil's harassment turned darker. They weren't just handing out fake violation notices anymore. They were blocking driveways, smashing mailboxes, and lurking like predators rather than neighborhood watchers. The street that once echoed with children's laughter now felt tense and hostile, like a war zone disguised as a suburban cul-de-sac. One evening, Tom sat on the porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. He looked out at the street, at the shadows creeping under the streetlights, and his mind drifted back, far away from Maplewood Drive. Flashbacks flickered in his mind. Dense jungle foliage, the harsh midday sun cutting through the leaves, the sound of boots on gravel, whispered commands in the dark. He remembered the long nights spent scanning horizons, the feeling of total focus and readiness. He remembered the training, relentless, grueling, precise. Close combat, tactical, awareness, negotiation, under threat, survival. His fingers twitched slightly, recalling the practiced grip on his sidearm, the weight of responsibility heavier than any weapon. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was his home, his son's home. Yet the same principles applied. Tom leaned forward, eyes narrowing. He wasn't about to let a couple of fake enforcers terrorize his family. The next morning, he began methodically taking action, not with fists, but with strategy. He installed cameras around the house and documented every move Mark and Phil made. He spoke quietly to neighbors, encouraging them to report incidents and stand together. He also made it clear to Mark and Phil, through firm but measured words, that they were being watched. Word spread fast. The neighborhood began to rally, albeit quietly. People who had been afraid to speak now whispered support, small acts of defiance, cars parked correctly, lawns trimmed, children playing in the streets again. One afternoon, Jake came home from school, looking pale. They followed me, Jake said, voice trembling near the park. They said if I told Dad it'd get worse. Tom's stomach tightened, but his face remained calm. He knelt down to look Jake in the eyes. Thank you for telling me, he said. You did the right thing. He promised himself then no more threats would reach Jake, no more fear. That evening, Tom met quietly with a few trusted neighbors, sharing what he knew, planning their next moves. But the pressure from Mark and Phil kept mounting. One night, Tom was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass outside. He peeked out to see a neighbor's mailbox smashed, another car's tires slashed. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was outright vandalism. Tom's jaw clenched. He knew he had to be ready for whatever came next. Later, alone in his study, Tom pulled out old documents, certificates of training, commendations from his military service, to anyone else. These were relics from a past life. To Tom, they were reminders of his capability and his responsibility. He couldn't let those skills fade. Not now. The following day, Mark and Phil approached Jake again, this time more brazenly. Tom arrived just in time. Mark stepped forward, voice dripping with menace. You don't belong here, kid. Tom's voice cut through the tension, calm and cold. Back off. Mark's smirk faltered, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. Tom didn't have to say more. His presence alone was a warning. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, some with relief, some with growing hope. Tom's edge was invisible, the result of years in the shadows, fighting silent wars. But now, it was protecting his son. And Mark and Phil were starting to realize that the man they thought was just another quiet neighbor was something far more dangerous. Maplewood Drive was no longer the peaceful street it once was. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and every neighbor felt it. Some locked their doors earlier. Others avoided stepping outside unless absolutely necessary. The carefree days of summer seemed like a distant memory. Tom Reynolds, however, was far from discouraged. If anything, the mounting pressure from Mark and Phil had lit a fire inside him. He wasn't about to let his family or his neighborhood fall under the thumb of a couple of imposters playing at power. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows over the street, Tom was fixing the fence in his front yard. He heard a commotion from across the street. Turning, he saw Mark loudly berating an elderly man about an imaginary violation. Phil stood nearby, nodding along and occasionally scribbling notes on his clipboard. Tom's jaw tightened. That was the last straw. He wiped his hands on his jeans and crossed the street. Mark, Tom called out, voice steady but loud enough to draw attention. Mark turned, his face tight with irritation. What do you want, Reynolds? Enough, Tom said simply. You're harassing people over made-up rules. This ends now. Mark laughed, a hollow, sharp sound. You think you can tell me what to do? I'm in charge here. Tom's gaze sharpened. You're nothing but a bully hiding behind fake authority. You're done. Phil started to step forward, but Mark waved him back. This isn't over. Mark spat. Tom took a breath. It is, because I'm not alone anymore. Just then, neighbors began stepping out of their homes, some with arms crossed, others holding their phones, ready to record. Tom had quietly rallied support, building a coalition of neighbors unwilling to live in fear. Mark's smirk faltered. He looked around, realizing his power was slipping. Fine, Mark sneered, but you'll regret this. Tom shook his head, voice calm but firm. No one's regretting standing up for what's right. As Mark and Phil backed away, Tom felt a surge of hope. The neighborhood was waking up. The tide was turning. Night. Tom sat with Jake on the porch swing. Looks like things are changing, Jake said, eyes bright. Tom smiled. They are. And it's because people like you and me refuse to be afraid. But the calm was fragile. In the quiet darkness, Tom knew Mark and Phil wouldn't back down easily. They were unpredictable, dangerous. Tom thought back to the military lessons he'd carried through life, that every opponent had a breaking point, but you had to be ready for anything. The next morning, a package arrived at Tom's door. No return address, no note, just a single, threatening message inside. Stay out of our way. Tom's face hardened. He folded the paper carefully and locked it away. He wasn't scared, because protecting Jake wasn't just a job, it was a promise. Tom Reynolds would keep that promise at any cost. The following days were a tense game. of cat and mouse. Mark and Phil tried subtle tactics, breaking windows, slashing tires, even vandalizing mailboxes on other streets to send a message. But Tom and the neighbors responded with vigilance, cameras, and police reports. One evening, Tom found himself face to face with Mark in a deserted alley behind the neighborhood park. Mark's voice was low, dangerous. "You're making this personal, Reynolds." Tom's reply was calm but unwavering. "When you threaten my family, it's always personal." A moment passed, charged with silent challenge. Then, unexpectedly, Mark laughed, bitter and tired. "This street will never be yours." Tom met his gaze steadily. "Maybe not, but I'll make sure you're gone before you hurt anyone else." That night, as Tom checked the security footage from his cameras, he saw something chilling. Mark and Phil meeting with another man. Someone unknown, exchanging what looked like cash. Tom's mind raced. This was bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. Someone was backing these fake enforcers. Someone wanted control. The quiet war on Maplewood Drive was escalating, and Tom knew the real battle was only just beginning. The footage haunted Tom as he watched it again and again. The shadowy meeting between Mark, Phil, and the unknown man, exchanging envelopes in the dim light behind the park. It was no longer a simple turf war. This was organized, calculated. He knew he couldn't face this alone. The next morning, Tom reached out to his old military contacts, sending a discreet message asking for advice and backup if necessary. Within hours, a trusted friend replied, offering support and reminding Tom to keep a low profile. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing. Some residents were emboldened by Tom's defiance. Others were still too afraid to get involved. One thing was clear: Mark and Phil had powerful allies, and those allies wanted control of Maplewood Drive at any cost. Tom organized a quiet meeting with several neighbors who had also experienced harassment. "We're not just dealing with bullies," Tom told them. "This is bigger. They're part of something, someone pulling strings behind the scenes." Susan, a mother of two, nodded grimly. "I caught one of them sneaking around my backyard last week. They're watching us." Tom's jaw tightened. Need to protect each other. Cameras, alerts, and no more isolation. Over the next few days, the neighborhood transformed. People worked together, setting up neighborhood watch groups, sharing information, and keeping close tabs on Mark and Phil. But Mark didn't stop. One afternoon, Tom's front yard was splattered with paint, a message meant to intimidate. Tom's son Jake watched quietly, a mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. "Dad," Jake whispered, "what if they come for us next?" Tom knelt down and looked him in the eyes. "They won't. I'll make sure of it." That night, Tom pored over the footage again, trying to get a better look at the mysterious man. Suddenly, he noticed something, a flash of a badge, barely visible under the street lamp's glare. His heart sank. This wasn't just some local thug. It was someone with authority, someone from the very system that was supposed to protect them. Tom's mind raced. Could the corruption be deeper than he thought? The next day, Tom approached a local police detective he trusted. He showed the footage. The detective's face darkened. "This is serious," she said quietly. "If this is what it looks like, we're dealing with corruption inside the department." Tom felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The fake enforcers had protection from the inside. The walls were closing in. But Tom wasn't about to give up. That evening, as he sat beside Jake, he told his son a story from his military days about a time when trust was shattered, but fighting for what's right meant pushing through even when it seemed impossible. Jake listened intently. "I'm not scared anymore," Jake said softly. Tom smiled. "Good, because we're going to need that courage." Suddenly, Tom's phone buzzed. A text message. No sender. Just 3 words. "Meet me, midnight." Tom's pulse quickened. Was this a trap, or the break he needed? He looked at Jake, asleep in the next room. "I have to do this," Tom whispered. He grabbed his jacket and keys. The quiet war on Maplewood Drive was about to explode, and Tom Reynolds was ready to face whatever came next. The clock on Tom's dashboard glowed 11:58 p.m. as he pulled his truck quietly onto the empty street behind the park. The cold night air bit at his face, but his nerves burned hotter. The message, "Meet me, midnight," was too vague to trust, but too important to ignore. Every step Tom took toward the meeting spot was calculated, instincts sharpened. From years in the military guiding him, he scanned every shadow, every rustle of leaves, alert to danger. A figure emerged from the darkness near a broken bench. The street lamp flickered overhead, revealing a familiar face. Detective Laura Mills. Tom's heart skipped. "Laura, what's going on?" She looked around nervously before speaking. "It's worse than you thought," she said, voice low. "Mark and Phil aren't working alone. There's a whole operation, and it runs deeper than just fake HOA enforcement. Corruption inside the police department is protecting them." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Who's behind it?" She hesitated, then pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Meetings, payments, threats, everything ties back to a city councilman, Jared Hale. He's using these fake enforcers to intimidate residents into selling their homes cheap. He wants to redevelop the neighborhood for a new shopping complex." Tom's jaw clenched. "And the police? They're turning a blind eye. Some officers are on the payroll. A sudden rustle startled them. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his side. "Stay close," he whispered. Laura nodded, pulling her badge from under her coat. "This ends now," Tom said grimly. The next morning, armed with the evidence Laura had gathered and Tom's own documentation, they contacted an independent task force. Within days, warrants were served, and the corrupt officers, Mark, Phil, and Councilman Hale, were arrested. News spread like wildfire. Maplewood Drive buzzed with relief and disbelief. The quiet neighborhood war had uncovered a major scandal, shaking the city's foundations. At a community meeting weeks later, Tom stood before his neighbors once again, this time greeted with applause rather than tension. "Together, we took back our home," Tom said, voice steady. "It wasn't easy. There were threats, fear, and doubt. But standing up, united, made all the difference." Jake beamed from the crowd, no longer the scared boy he had been months before. Then, as Tom looked out over the neighborhood, a surprising face stepped forward. Mark, now handcuffed but calm. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I never realized what I was part of until it was too late." Tom nodded. "It's never too late to make things right." The story of Maplewood Drive became a symbol, a reminder that courage, unity, and vigilance can overcome even the darkest threats. And as Tom tucked Jake into bed that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in months: peace. Because no matter the battle, the greatest victory is protecting those you love.